maybe just present myself to those that do not know me. I'm Gabriele Sack. I'm the journal manager of the journal, Continuous in Human Dynamics. So we are delighted today to let the ground to Jaya and Iris to present their successful special issue where you all collaborated. Thanks a lot for this, and we look forward to having a nice and inspiring discussion with you. My journal specialist is Elena. As you can see, she's one of them down in the box here. And then for those who do not know, Jane, she's the chief editor of the Refugees and Conflict section. Hello, Jane.
Hello, sorry, I'm not putting on my video because my connection is bad at the moment, but hello to everyone and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for being here, Jane and Gabriele, and to all of you. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure other people will come in as we get going, but in the interest of everyone's time, I think we'll get moving. So we just wanted to start by talking about the motivation behind the volume, and you know, what we ended up with, which was really just a wonderful collection and very rich. So our goal was really to provide one of the first cross-cutting comparative analyses of domestic, regional, and international legal and policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I said, we were just very pleased with the output. It's a volume that's very rich and also very broad, right, in terms of content, and the quality is very strong. So the goal in part was to be a mapping exercise to bring together a group of authors from Europe, North and South America, and Israel to identify the range of destination state responses, identifying patterns and distinctions. And again, the final result is a volume with very broad geographical perspective. In particular, we were interested in what these responses said about the fragility of EU free movement rules, reinstitution of border controls in the Schengen region, and travel bans on non-citizens from a range of countries, as well as violations of international law, testing humanitarian commitments of destination states, and the binding international law around migration. We were also really looking for critical analyses that situated these responses in the context of the recent growth of exclusionary migration regimes and anti-migrant politics, as well as proposals to mitigate the harms that may result from these policies, both immediately and once the pandemic is behind us. And we obviously got plenty of critical analyses, and we'll talk more about them in the conversation today. And I'll hand the rest of the introduction over to Edith.
Thanks so much, Jaya, and thank you all again for coming and joining us today. So another point that I would like to mention, apart from the most important ones that Jaya has already mentioned, is that our aim when gathering you all in this ebook was to promote certain democratic values and principles, primarily the importance of the protection of human rights, free movement, and the importance of interstate and international cooperation. And we were really satisfied with the results. We think that all of your contributions actually convey these messages that we also wanted you to convey. And we also wanted to work with you, our authors. And we wanted to enhance cooperation and the networking among migration scholars from so many different continents. So there are 4 continents that were involved in this project. And this event, where currently we are at, as I see, number 24 present, and I suppose there will be more people joining, actually shows that we have managed to do this. And we managed to get you here despite your busy schedules, which proves that our goal of putting us all together has been realized. So the end result has really been much more than we initially planned it to be, and we are really satisfied with it. And thank you all for your great contributions, both in terms of writing your pieces and also to this discussion. And we particularly want to thank Frontiers, which is an open access platform and which enabled us to publish this book. And particular thanks goes, of course, to Gabrielle, our editor. And Gabrielle is excited to work on similar projects in the future. So if any of you is interested in the future of proposing another ebook or a special issue of Frontiers, please feel free to approach Gabrielle. We know that he will be very much open to your ideas. So thanks. And now we come to the discussion part. Jaya.
Yes. And I also just wanted to recognize Jane Friedman, who is the editor of Refugees and Conflict, for making all of this possible. So thank you, Jane, and thanks for being here. All right, so let's dive into the discussion. I think there's going to be plenty to say, and then we wanted to take less time for the intro, and so there's more time to talk. And so what we really wanted to talk about was the impact of migration law and policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of continuities and breaks with the past. That's one of the questions we asked you initially, kind of exploring what has stayed the same, what has perhaps magnified, and what has changed. So the first question that I wanted to throw out, and please feel free just to raise your hand, and we'll call on you, either your virtual hand or your actual hand, if you want to jump into the conversation. So one of the themes we saw in your contributions is that several of you talked about the determination of who is essential and who is not. And in particular, this determination was made with reference to labor migrants and students. So I wanted to ask about what continuities and what breaks you see with the past in this use of the category essential, right? We saw, I think, in many different places, this idea that essential migrants could move and others could not. So does anyone want to take on this idea of the essential migrants? Yes, Audrey, please jump in. Your piece was terrific on this front.
I'll just do this to get the conversation going. I surely hear from other people than me. Of course, the idea of essential is, in its first kind of obvious understanding, essential to the state, essential to the state's economic, political well-being. In my piece, I tried to break down, though, the different valences of essential, and to talk about people who are conceived of, or labor work that is conceived of as economically essential, like people in the agricultural food production industry or healthcare, those whose entries were politically essential, and in Canada that happened to be, for example, immediate family members of those who were already in Canada as permanent residents and so on, and citizens, and those who might be considered economically, politically, or otherwise essential in other ways. And I think it's important to recognize the different meanings of essential here. And one particular point, I think, that came clearly through here is that, for example, workers who are politically essential, who are economically essential, people who work in agriculture, food production, this was a stark reminder that work can be considered essential, but the people who do it aren't necessarily valued for the work they do. And so you have people who are seen to be privileged in the sense that they are allowed to enter, but in fact, the wages and working conditions to which they are exposed remain degraded, and indeed the health and safety circumstances under which they're exposed are inferior. So we saw that people in those industries were getting sicker more often because they weren't given proper PPE. And you see that, kind of playing out. So is there continuity with? Yes, because we see that certain kinds of work that is actually essential is nevertheless, the people who do it are nevertheless degraded. Is there a break with the past? Well, yes, because now they are formally labeled as essential and we're forced to confront. I'll just leave it at that.
Great, great. Thanks so much. And Tali Kreitzman Amir, who I think is going to try to join us later, had a very similar take from Israel, talking about how labor migrants are allowed to enter, but their rights are left behind. And so once they enter, they're not treated like humans. Yes, Elspeth, please jump in.
Yes, this was very much also a European issue that I think it came as a bit of a shock when the Commission issued its first document on prioritizing who should be able to cross borders after this rather unexpected use of border controls as a mechanism to try and control a pandemic. And when the Commission sought to prioritize who should be able to cross borders without obstacles, of course, the very first people were themselves. So it was bureaucrats who should be able to travel. So that I thought was really interesting because it shows how bureaucracies work. Who's important? Well, it's us who are drawing up the rules. And if we don't get to travel, then the world's going to come to an end. But then, of course, it was the categories which had not been considered to be high priority, certainly in EU law on third country nationals admission. All kinds of health workers from the bottom to the top, and of course, seasonal workers. Europe closed down really in March 2020, just as the asparagus harvest was coming forward. And the thought that Europeans would let their asparagus just rot in the fields was beyond anyone's comprehension. And so all of the rules were relaxed for seasonal workers. And the other group for whom extraordinary measures were taken, including the creation of so-called green corridors. Why they were green, I don't know, because it didn't have anything to do with ecology. But anyway, leaving that aside, these corridors were created was for the long distance lorry drivers. So all of a sudden, the integration of European supply chains was recognized as being utterly dependent on the transport industry, on the trains, on the lorries in particular. And not only were all of the restrictions lifted for them in these so-called green corridors created, but also, and quite controversially, it hasn't been fully explored yet, many member states modified the Working Time Directive, which places very strict limits on how many hours lorry drivers can drive before they have to take breaks, to allow them to work longer hours, though then there was compensation with longer rest periods afterwards. But that was very problematic because of the profound health and safety issues which it raised. Anybody who was traveling on the major intercity highways across Europe in the spring of 2020 were saying that the only users of those highways were in fact the large articulated lorries. And of course, they then had a problem that there was nowhere to have lunch or dinner or anything else because everything else was closed. So then there was the problem about, how do you deliver the conditions of possibility to create these supply chains which actually work.
Yes, Gareth, please jump in.
Thanks. I mean, also in the European Union, I was actually quite surprised at how few people were considered essential. The high degree to which movement just came to a stop, whereas until quite recently, the rhetoric was of the integrated market and the incredible importance of movement. And you realize there's a distinction between, if you like, the people who might be important to the economy and the people whose movement is important. And essentially the professional classes, one of the lessons we learned from this, don't need to go anywhere except for their own pleasure. And I wonder, they're the classes that are where everyone says, it's so important to get them, visas for them, and we have to attract them to our city and we have to attract them to our business. I think one thing you'd say is, you shouldn't have any visas. You should only have work visas for those who work with their hands and do physical work, because they're the ones who need to move. Anyone with an education can, in fact, functionally spend their life at home. And that's I find that quite an alarming lesson, actually.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm kind of interested in the comparative perspective here, one of the consequences we're seeing right now in the US is there's an incredible labor shortage in kind of low wage work, in particular restaurants, all these industries. And yet we're still enforcing the pandemic border policy, and we won't let anyone in at the border. And there's no kind of rational conversation about perhaps migrants could fill these labor needs. It's just the borders must be shut, and we have a labor shortage. And how do we deal with this? I'm kind of interested to hear from, if anyone from North America wants to jump in as well, but I'm interested to hear what others are seeing on that front, or anything else about the essential category that folks want to talk about. I know Mari-Lise and Leif had some interesting points about this as well. Yeah, please jump in. Am I saying that right, Leif?
Leif, hello. For me, the question is maybe more who is spendable. We studied the migration policy and contestation around it in Estonia. That has quite, let's say, an evolutionary way in managing migration. And this COVID crisis coincided with the rise of right-wing populist parties and also the entry into the government. So they started to pressure for migration restrictions. Estonia is not a hugely open country anyway, but still we have quite significant immigration for several years. The net rate is positive. And at first, EKRE tried to restrict, for example, seasonal workers and target maybe more vulnerable groups. But it met quite strong resistance from businesses. So they partially shifted and looked for other targets and found a good target in foreign students. Universities in Estonia are quite weak. Foreign students themselves, of course, are also weak. So the compromise EKRE reached was actually more targeting foreign students than seasonal workers, although both were affected. And somehow seen from this political strategic perspective, who is spendable and who is essential, sheds maybe new light also on who is vulnerable. Because it seems, at least to an extent, entrepreneurs have a say in several countries. But to think beyond it, yes, there are weak groups, but for a policymaker, in fact, a student migrant is a real asset. He's laborious, he's ready to learn, study, and still he could easily become a target. So this is a lesson for us in terms of policy making.
Yes, absolutely. Shova and then Sean.
Hi, everyone. And this is less the focus of our chapter, but I thought I'd engage the question on the North America front, and maybe building on what Jaya started with labor shortage and exclusion, and with those who are already here, right? So those who are deemed essential, frontline workers, many of whom may be in a status of non-status, right? If they are here without documentation, or they may be here temporarily or have a temporary visa that's tied to an employer that makes it difficult for them to move. We saw this with a lot of physicians who were in the front lines and unable to be mobile in helping or treating patients who were struck with COVID. So I think that's a continuum, right? The sort of absence of any kind of long-term solution for those who are here, who are essential, and those who might be trying to reach here. What I do think is a little bit of a break, and I don't know if this fits into anyone's concept of essential, is how family has been treated in the pandemic. You know, family has really been the hallmark of U.S. immigration law. It's the major route for permanent immigration. And we saw in the name of COVID, exclusionary measures that even kept out, you know, close and immediate family relationships. And that to me was really a break from the immigration design and who we have valued historically.
Yeah, and even close family members in Europe, which is something that we've not seen at all, right? Yeah. So, Sean?
Hi, everyone. I really like the collection. It's fun to read all of the, well, I don't know what fun. It's interesting to read all of the different perspectives and to see the parallels and the differences across the various jurisdictions. So thanks so much, everyone, for your contributions. I'm of two minds about how seriously we take the idea of essential. So on the one hand, I find that this idea of whose travel is essential is rhetorically potentially powerful and interesting. And so, you know, I've done some media work around the idea that in the Canadian context, the Canadian government chose to label the travel of professional hockey players as essential, but asylum seekers as not essential. And so you can make these arguments about, well, you know, we really should be taking this group seriously. Or in the example that Audrey gave, we've labeled agricultural laborers as essential. Well, I think that opens up some space for advocates to say, well, if this group is essential, then surely they should be treated well, their labor rights should be respected, and so on. So there's some rhetorical worth, I think, to this concept of essential travel. But if the question is, does this help us understand the policies? I think my answer is no, that you could replace the word essential with authorized and not lose anything at all. So I guess when I'm thinking of the question of essential, I think my question is, how do we want to use this this concept? Is it about political interventions, or is it about kind of analytical clarity?
Thanks so much for that contribution, Sean. So before we move on to the next question, Sandra, you also had some interesting pointers about this in your piece. Is there anything you want to add to the conversation before we move into the next question?
Yes, maybe just to say it again, that from an EU perspective, I think this whole question of essential was a bit of a surprise, because these are not the legal categories under which we discuss free movement in the EU. So, but maybe to a certain extent, I think it does fit within an economic reading of free movement, right? Where essential is who is essential for the economy. So that fits very well with critiques of the regime of free movement in the EU as being a market sort of citizenship. It's not really about citizenship, a real citizenship, but it's simply mobility with an economic purpose, right? And this is the only thing that matters. But I would say that what has become increasingly clear is that the people whose mobility and whose work is essential for the EU economy as Gareth also said, are not necessarily the ones we normally associate with essential, right? The highly paid migrants. And also in the EU context, it's increasingly clear that we have entire sectors of economies in certain member states who are dependent on migrant EU workers, and that those labor shortages are not going to be filled by the national workers. And the sort of solutions that have been tried out in the EU by several member states, and Germany also tweaking working hours of agricultural workers to allow the ones who are already there to work longer to harvest, that this is not a long-term or structural solution. And I think that should also maybe open a serious discussion about the type of migration policy that the EU wants to have in the long term, right? I think this is a lesson for the EU in terms of how it should think about migration policy in the future. And I think also what has changed is that, yes, there has been a recognition that these people are essential but vulnerable, but in practical terms, how this will play out in future legislation, it is for me unclear. So I'm now part of a project with Professor De Lange, and she cannot be here, but we're looking at COVID, the impact of COVID on migrants in the Netherlands, and you see that there has been a lot of media attention when we had the outbreaks of COVID outbreaks among migrant workers. But after that, can we maintain momentum and push for positive changes? I think that is a question that at the moment is a bit unclear for me. Yeah, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leisa.
Yes. Well,
and am I saying your name correctly? Please correct me if I've got it.
Leisa, thanks a lot. I wanted to add a bit on what Sean was just saying on the meaning of essential. And I wanted to provide just 2 examples on South America on informal essential workers. In South America, it happened to be, there are two precise examples of some categories of workers that became unofficially essential. One is domestic workers and some practices emerged in order to give them some mobility rights very informally in order to let them move within countries. And this happened in many countries. Another category are construction workers who were able to move between, at the peak of the pandemic, in the middle of the lockdown, between the borders of Brazil and Paraguay during the day to go back and forth because of the economic structure in that border and how important construction workers are. So adding a bit to this, the informality and the merchants, without calling them essential, they unofficially became essential.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, Gareth?
Just thinking about those kinds of movements, I think it's sort of important to make the point, although we all know it, that the essential workers, it's not as if they get a kind of a free pass and can go cheerfully up and down as they like. I mean, quite often what it means is that they can move to a state where they can work in fairly poor conditions, but then they're deprived still of the chance to, say, go home for visits, to have visits, of a lot of contact, and like even truck drivers who do move up and down, but sometimes it's meant they've had to live in their cabs because they're not allowed to get out and go into hotels. And so, that movement, in a way, it's not so much a privilege for them, it's a privilege for those who profit from it. I mean, someone did describe lockdown rather brilliantly. What was it? As rich people hiding while poor people bring them things. And I think, in a way you can say essential means essential for the quality of life of the middle class, for whom there has actually been a fairly remarkable continuity of lifestyle, whereas those who are classified as essential, their lives have got an awful lot harder because their movement is, very much instrumentalized for others.
Yeah, absolutely. And as evidenced by the very differential rates of COVID deaths, right, in the populations. I was just listening to a story the other day about COVID orphans, right? And that's that's not happening to rich people, right? We know where that's happening. All right, so let's move on to a question about continuity. So several of you discussed continuities with repressive policies on migration. So with colonialism, with emergency and crisis regulation, with nationalist populism, with backlash against immigrants. So you know, I think it might be helpful to lay that out a little bit. A lot of you had very helpful analytical frames in that, and also just to think about whether there's a way forward out of these continuities. And you know, we've already touched on that a little bit, but this is of course a story of migration and migration regulation, and is there any space to move forward? I think Sandra was talking a little bit about structural change. Anyone want to take on the continuities? Yes, Marie-Lise.
Hi, it's a real privilege to be here. So our paper was looking at this continuity versus change through the concept of focusing events. So whether the COVID crisis could function as this focusing event when, let's say, an issue which has been around for a while is getting a lot of public attention and then could also lead to policy change. And as Leif also described earlier on, the situation in Estonia at the moment was that we were having a government, a coalition government in power, which included the populist radical right EKRE, which was kind of seeking for their moment to turn well, already relatively conservative immigration policy even towards more rigid forms, especially regarding short-term migration, which has become really relaxed in more recent years. And this COVID crisis certainly allowed them to impose temporary measures. So Estonia at first basically barred all non-essential movements until the end of July 2020 and later to the end of August 2020. And EKRE was trying to seize this moment to actually start barring, especially seasonal migration, even further. So in Estonia, we don't grow asparagus, we grow strawberries. And they were ripening in May and June, and this is the kind of high season for a lot of seasonal migrants coming to Estonia. And so we had kind of our strawberry crisis here in Estonia. And basically what, in a nutshell, our story or findings were from this case was that they did not manage to seize the moment in terms of making labor migration policies more rigid, because as Leif already said, they had powerful allies in the form of employers who were not interested in barring this this type of migration. But also because of having coalition governments, so to say. So the other coalition partners, which are also relatively conservative parties, were really reluctant to give in to EKRE because being against migration is EKRE's thing, and they kind of didn't want to give them too much ground or too many laurels, so to say, for their topic. So in those terms, we can say that there were some political factors which did not allow the COVID crisis to turn into a focusing event. But on the other hand, we also have to look at the kind of different dynamics of labor migration. So in Estonia, as in many other countries, you have different types of migration, and the COVID crisis did not affect all of them similarly. So for instance, the construction sector started to experience a boom because not all constructions were closed down, schools were ordering renovations and so on, and you actually needed more kind of a labor market. So we kind of saw this combination of economic and political factors which did not allow the COVID crisis to play out as a focusing event in terms of making labor migration more strict.
Thank you, Simchana.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations actually to all of us to have this book launch. It was a great experience. Well, I find your question very important, really very important. So greetings to all now from Dubrovnik, where I am on one seminar concerning actually the question also of security and transitional justice. And coming from a border country, which is in the newspaper all the time regarding pushbacks, I have to say that we have to, in my opinion, we have to look at migration policy definitely globally. And we cannot take the context of what is going on everywhere when we are discussing migration policy. What do I mean by that? For instance, Afghanistan is the result of many failures in transitional justice policies. Definitely the question of migration, in my opinion, is linked to the failed state, to what is going on in the countries full of conflict, etc. So COVID, definitely, in the beginning of the crisis in Croatia, raised an important question about putting more emphasis on protection of economic, social, and cultural rights as such, and especially taking into account that we have to deal with root causes of problems everywhere in order, if we want to have more secure immigration policy, less conflict, that we are less pushbacks after all. So I think that if we lose momentum, right now, somebody was mentioning that already, that there is a chance that we will lose it as time passes. I think it will be a great shame, definitely. Talking about political and structural changes and immigration policy and transitional justice policy, I think that now in the last, I don't know how many of you are aware of the last transitional justice policy of the EU, that stated that again, we are leaving to the processes of internally led transitional justice policy to bring more democracy and rule of law in the states that need help. And if we leave it like that, I think that we will have more problems with migration, more pushbacks, more pressure on the border countries, more issues that we'll have to address regarding healthcare of migrants, lack of healthcare. I know that I said a lot of things right now. I wanted to share my thoughts with you, but I'm quite pessimistic and optimistic in the same moment, that we just have to be interdisciplinary and globally and think what we can really contribute and take this COVID migration crisis as something that can serve as an incentive that we do better. Okay, I ended my, my line of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Denise?
Thanks. Yeah, it really, oh, sorry, I was trying to get my hand down. All right. It really is so lovely to be here with all of you. Thank you all for doing this. So in terms of continuities, I think the history of the US border enforcement measures during COVID is largely a history of continuity plus expansion, sort of increased controls at the border. I think it's a history of a story of continuity in a couple of different ways. The most obvious is the idea of crisis mode of security that has been the approach that has been used at our border for many years now, kind of increasingly so, you know, really with a couple of inflection points in '96, but then again, of course, in 2001 after 9/11, and then in 2014 with increased arrivals at the border, and kind of continually ratcheting up the discourse around threat, fraud, security breaches at the border as being the issue that requires a reaction in terms of border policy. But in addition to that, I also think there's some continuity around treating asylum as an exceptional tool, sort of that asylum should be far from the norm or an expectation, but rather should be a rare and scarce privilege that is granted in only the most sort of unique and, pardon the use of the very problematic term, exotic cases coming from as far away from the United States as possible, where we can conceive that these would actually be asylum cases, as opposed to coming from our neighbors in Mexico or Central America. And this has been kind of a theme around treating asylum seekers that isn't just at the border, but also within the United States, of, you know, thinking of detention as a normal tool for many people in various migration statuses, but including asylum seekers, even where they've made their way into the country before seeking protection, even sometimes on visas and the like. Use of detention, low grant rates for asylum, again, much easier recognition of asylum claims from distant countries as opposed to neighboring countries and the like. And so those are all continuities that then I think came into serious play with the outbreak of COVID in terms of border policies that were adopted. And here I do think you saw mostly an expansion of existing outlooks and trends, with some uniqueness to it as well. Because what really became unique about border policies in light of COVID was the extent to which US policy actually physically excluded at the border in ways that really had not taken place before, even with the ramp up of exclusionary policies that made life exceedingly difficult and challenging for those seeking to enter and seek asylum, but without much ability to actually physically just block people at our southern border. But that's exactly what happened with COVID, particularly through the use of Title 42, which is this use of Centers for Disease Control policy orders to say that asylum seekers, and it really was very much directed at asylum seekers, happy to go into that a little bit more if it'd be useful, that we're going to completely block and expel them immediately, either to Mexico or to their home countries, despite the extreme dangers in Mexico and in home countries of refoulement, and despite many, many clear pieces of legislation in the United States that require processing of asylum seekers at the border. And just kind of a final thought on how that was both, you know, a continuity measure, but also a breach is, you know, I think in Europe, at least, a lot of the discussion around kind of border measures and border blockades has been around kind of increasing barriers at the border to protect a system that internally is seen, maybe not actually so completely in reality, and I'll love to hear from from the European colleagues about whether I'm even right on this, but there's been a sense that inside is soft on asylum, that there are lots of benefits to asylum, lots of measures that help asylum seekers, and that the asylum process itself is pretty open. And so there's this need to block at the border. I think in the US, it really was a bit different. I feel like the internal was already quite harsh and restrictive and exclusionary, and that just kind of pushed its way out towards the border as part of a similar kind of ethos of exclusion that, you know, kind of started in the middle and then pushed outward, and has even, of course, pushed beyond our southern border as well. And then maybe when we come to it, we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, kind of updates on what's happening. But one other connection I wanted to make before going there to the last conversation about labor is, I think one thing that we have to see as happening at our southern border too is that traditionally in the US, labor has been the problematic migration. You know, they're stealing our jobs and the rest. Asylum refugee law, in some ways in the public, not necessarily in policy, has been seen as the good migration, the okay migration. And it does feel as though that has flipped somewhat. Not that we're allowing the labor in necessarily, but that there is this sense that we might need labor, whereas migrants have, refugees and asylum seekers have been seen as much more negative. And frankly, I think realistically, and that's helped to justify some of the exclusionary policies at the border, because what we're seeing at the border right now is mostly a refugee flow, or significantly a refugee flow. I think it could be that those are changing dynamics around who we see as essential, but I think it may also just be the reality that whoever is at our border, whoever is seeking to come in, is who we want to de-emphasize as positive, that there's always sort of this exclusionary tendency, whichever group it is that's coming. Some thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I think that's absolutely right. And that flip, asylum seekers as bad and labor migrants as good, was already happening under the Trump administration, and the pandemic just really magnified that switch. Sandra and then Sean.
Okay, thank you. Very shortly, and maybe from quite a different perspective, what I found interesting in the example I discussed in the book, which is Romania, as a sort of point of continuation, is the very fraught relationship of the Romanian state with its own diaspora. Right, so these are the Romanian migrants who are working abroad in the EU, and we have estimates of about 3 million working age Romanians working elsewhere, and a shrinking population. And it's interesting to see that a lot of them are in Italy and in Spain, and these were countries that were hard hit by the first wave. And when the discussion is, well, what happens if they return, the first sort of instinctual decision is to say, well, we should try to prevent them from returning, right? So this is why I think it's interesting to think, are these disposable citizens, right? They are disposable labor force for the Romanian state because it cannot provide enough jobs for them. So they have to work elsewhere. But when such a pandemic happens and they are still Romanian nationals entitled to protection of the Romanian state, and they are trying to reach their state of nationality, what happens, right? And here I think there's quite a lot to be said, because on one hand, we see this type of measures whereby the borders are being closed, commercial flights are suspended, international traffic, road traffic is suspended as well. But at the same time, right, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is repatriating Romanians from other EU countries. So when we talk about restrictive policies, I think it also depends at what parts of the state we're looking at. Right? And the Romanian example shows that, you know, is it coherent? I don't think so. I think it does leave us with a big question, at least for the Romanian government, is what does it want from its diaspora? Is it simply a source of remittances? Are they not entitled to protection at all from the Romanian state? And I think this is where I also see some changes, because especially after the COVID outbreaks in Germany and in the Netherlands and in other EU states, which were very much discussed in Romania, you do see the Romanian government actually for the first time engaging in some more serious bilateral discussions with other EU states about how it can do better in terms of protection. And this year, they also changed the legislation on agency workers to oblige the agencies to actually report to the labor inspectorate data concerning migrants. So not only the numbers, but data that they can identify these people, and if necessary, then extend protection, which is quite novel. So there is continuity, but there's also some hope for change. Now, how enforcement is actually the big issue in terms of labor rights, but at least there is some more thought being put in how to deal with these Romanians who are working abroad, and also what does it mean when you have so many citizens working abroad for your social protection systems, because at some point they will return, and again, are they entitled to protection or not? And I have to say that if you look at public opinion, it's quite polarized.
Thank you. Sean?
I wanted to add just a little bit of complexity about the story of what's going on in the US in terms of continuities as seen from outside the US. And so from a Canadian perspective, one of the big policy objectives of the Canadian government in the last 30 years on the refugee file is to persuade the United States to prevent asylum seekers from leaving the United States and coming to Canada. And so this has really been the core policy objective, because if Canada could entirely close off that flow, Canada would significantly decrease the number of asylum seekers that it's responsible for. And so Canada, the United States, has no interest in participating in that process, because it would mean that the US becomes responsible for more asylum seekers who would otherwise leave and go to Canada. So the US has long refused to play ball in terms of blocking this flow of asylum seekers. Canada, though, has successfully leveraged two crises to persuade the US to help in this regard. And the first was 9/11, where the US becomes preoccupied with security, and Canada says, hey, we'll help out. But if you could just do this as one little favor and enter into a safe third country agreement with us so that we can send any asylum seekers who cross the border back to you, we'd really appreciate it. And the US strangely agreed to that. From a Canadian government perspective, it was a flawed agreement because there was an exception. If you didn't cross at an official port of entry, you were able to circumvent the safe third country agreement. And in the past decade, the number of people doing that increased dramatically, especially under the Trump administration. So what happens with COVID? Canada says, aha, another moment of crisis. The US is preoccupied with its southern border at the moment and COVID. And so we ask nicely and say, could you please temporarily close off this loophole whereby people get around the safe third country agreement by crossing the border irregularly? And once again, surprisingly, the US says yes. And so from a Canadian perspective, it's very strange to watch the increasingly negative rhetoric and policy in the United States at its southern border, and no attention to the way that Canada is leveraging moments of crisis to get the US to act against its own perceived interest at the northern border. In the context of 9/11, the moment of crisis, the policy that was brought in, safe third country agreement, lasted for a long time. It remains to be seen whether that will be true of COVID.
Thanks so much, Sean. Louisa, and then Leif.
I think Leif was first. Do you want to go first, Leif?
I was giving you the chance to go first because you haven't spoken yet, but we can do whatever makes sense.
No big difference from my part. I was thinking of adding some European flavor to this discussion, and maybe a slightly more optimistic tone with regard to all of these temporary measures. In Europe, there is a visible will to reduce the barriers once again for free movement. Of course, it's then intra-European Union movement in between the member states, but still most of the COVID measures with this regard were temporary, and they are still seen as temporary. So I would imagine that if possible, at least this part of this temporary restrictions will be alleviated. As for third countries, it's of course a more complex question.
All right, I'll take the mic up then. Thank you everyone for being here, all your contributions in writing and now in the discussion. In terms of continuity and change, what we see in South America, and Marcia Vera and I wrote on Chile and Peru, but what we see in other countries as well, is that in the first instance with COVID, if we think about, so just to summarize what we feel, I think what many of us that analyze South America feel in general is that what took decades in North America and Europe happened in sort of a fast forward 5-year span with the Venezuelan displacement crisis in the last 5 years. We have close to 6 million, officially 5.7 million displaced Venezuelans outside of Venezuela. I'm currently in Germany, and I still get flabbergasted. I forgot during the pandemic, which I spent in Peru, that people do not know about Venezuela. People outside South America do not really know about the Venezuelan displacement crisis, even people working on migration and displacement issues. It's fascinating. But I guess it's a small world and it's a big world after all, right? That's what we always see. So our initial reactions were very welcoming, especially from center-right governments who wanted to send a strong message against the Venezuelan regime. But we're talking a lot of people in countries that were really not prepared to this mass influx of displaced migrants, refugees. UNHCR actually has invented a new category, the Venezuelans displaced outside of Venezuela, which is also very interesting and worth discussing maybe at a different point in time. The point is that public opinion shifted, and it shifted quickly after two to 3 years, I would say, before the pandemic. So I'm talking 2018, 19, we started seeing the same discourses on Venezuelans bring crime, they take away jobs. That was the first argument. And then the second argument, they bring crime. And with the pandemic, what we saw is that in Peru, at the very least, Peru was, we were the country with the highest death rate per 100,000 inhabitants, worse than India. So the pandemic just took over everything. So we actually did a media analysis for UNHCR. It was very interesting to see how, where before COVID hit Peru, it was about migrants and crime, and that was what sold, right? But then it was almost an opportunity, right? Because for a couple of months, or at least the first year at the very least of the pandemic, those were the news, and it's still sort of ongoing. And unfortunately, it was only a little break, right? We maybe saw it as an opportunity to come back to more positive narratives, which unfortunately has not happened. And what we're seeing now is that, like in Peru, very clearly with the new government, the discourse of migration and crime and mass deportations. I mean, they just learned very quickly and are now trying to implement all sorts of horrible things. But I just wanted to throw this into the discussion, how though maybe now we see the same negative discourses we saw pre-COVID. It was almost a bit of a breather for people working on migration and refugee issues, because the pressure, the negative reporting was taken off the link between Venezuelan migrants and refugees and crime.
Thanks so much. Audrey?
Thanks. So I wanted to pick up on a few points that people had made. One, in thinking about continuity and change with borders and bordering, I wanted to actually suggest that maybe we're looking in the wrong place for the change. That is, borders themselves are doing what borders have always done. They may be doing them with greater extremity, violence, coercion in some respects, but in a sense, they are doing qualitatively what they've always done. What's happened that seems to me to have profoundly changed was the background landscape of what is presumed to be free movement within a state, and in regional situations, free movement across states. But that's, in a sense, somewhat exceptional. It's a kind of mimicry of what we imagine to be free movement within a state. And so the idea is that the status quo ante is stasis at the border, but free movement within borders. And what's profoundly changed is not the role that borders play, but what's happening inside borders, which is stasis. All stasis all the time. That's what was a real change. The kind of shift from we all move freely in our daily lives, in our cities, and the sort of thing that I think Gareth was talking about, right? This sort of free movement within borders has become stasis, or became stasis. And within that then, borders and the role that borders have always played in arresting people, stopping their movement, becomes enrolled into a larger project of stasis. Right? It's no longer as distinctive as it once was. And so I think in a way, that's, the continuity is borders are doing what borders have always done. The change is that the landscape of free movement within borders changed profoundly. At least that would be one view. A couple other things to pick up on. I thought Leif earlier talked about foreign students, and so I wanted to again mention a kind of a continuity versus change thing. So it's interesting that in Estonia, foreign students were regarded as, in some sense, dispensable and vulnerable. In Canada, until about, I'd say 20 years ago, foreign students, international students, that whole project was understood in what I call a neo-colonial lens, as a kind of foreign aid. We help foreign students, we're doing them a favor by letting them come to Canada, get this education, and then go back to their homelands where they can, uplift their people or something. It's a very kind of neo-colonial understanding of it. That has completely flipped over into a very neoliberal one, where they are sources of critical revenue for underfunded universities. And as such, they then became economically essential to Canada in a way that clearly they weren't or are not in Estonia. But it really is, again, situated, COVID kind of exposed that transformation in international students. They need to be here because we need the revenue, and also because they hope to ultimately, and we dangle in front of them the possibility of transitioning to permanent residence in order to make Canada a more attractive destination for students than, for example, the United States. And two more quick points. One about refugees, and here, there is this interesting idea of essentialness that I tried to address briefly in my article about being economically essential, politically essential, and legally essential. Well, in some sense, it is legally essential to admit refugees to the extent that states are bound by the Refugee Convention. But to the extent that essential is actually understood as aligning with domestic self-interest, refugees are cast out of that, even if their admission is in some sense legally essential. And that's distinct from citizens. Again, it's legally essential to admit them, but it would also be politically unpalatable to refuse them, except apparently in Australia. So again, there's continuity and change and exceptions all over the place about that. And so that seems to me to be a significant point for Australia in actually explicitly shifting the status of citizens outside of Australia, many of whom are racialized, but not all of them. And the last thing I'll say really quickly is about how another continuity thing in Canada. So Canada has this, reputation that is somewhat undeserved, and Sean has spelled out some of the reasons for that in relation to refugees. But one of the things that the Canadian government has done is introduced a couple of short-term temporary programs to allow people who are essential workers to transition to permanent residence. There's one category for refugees and another for other migrant workers. Well, this sounds very nice Canadian thing to do, right? But I want to say two things about it, which are typically Canadian. One is that this is organized according to a logic of deservingness, right? If you've done a certain kind of work, working in the case of refugee claimants directly with people who are in long-term care facilities or otherwise patients, then you are deserving. If you happen to be working in the cafeteria of that institution, you're not deserving, right? So there's a logic of deservingness, which in the short term, you want to help people, get them permanent residence. In the long term, logics of deservingness, I think, are very dangerous as the normative foundation for enrolling people into secure permanent status. And the second is that these programs are tiny, tiny, tiny. And the number of people who qualify is going to be quite small, and the bureaucratic hurdles to getting admitted are high. So again, it's a kind of not entirely virtue signaling, but there is a sense of looks good, but when you drill down, not so much. There are not so many people who are actually getting the benefit of it. Thanks.
Thanks for that contribution, Elspeth, and then Gareth.
Thanks so much. I mean, I agree entirely with Audrey that, you know, as soon as we have any crisis, the first thing that our interior ministries do is to try and reinsert massive amounts of discretion into every single part of the immigration system and to abolish any issue of rights or law. But I just wanted to come back to, I mean, what was COVID and border controls about? And I want to come back to our public health problem. Because certainly in the European context, our public health people, and we had a moment of truth with our health ministries, where we realized that they had no more agreement among their experts than we had among any of the experts on migration or whatever you'd like. So they were just as incoherent as the rest of us, whereas we'd always thought that medicine was a source of real knowledge. But then what health ministries wanted to do was to keep everybody at home. Yeah, they didn't really care about borders. All they wanted was for everybody to stay at home and slow down the transmission of the disease. Because for them, and this was clear from the very beginning, that they more or less knew that we were all going to get COVID until we got vaccinated. And the British health ministry, education ministers said last week that 50% of children going to school up to the ages of 12 who haven't been vaccinated will get COVID in the first 3 months and the other 50% in the second 3 months. And by the end of the year, they will all have had COVID and suck it up. Which I thought was, you know, a very Ministry of Health kind of approach, where this has nothing to do with borders. It only has to do with protecting our public health services, which have been hollowed out by a whole series of measures over the last 20 years. And if they were still in the same good shape they had been about 20 years ago, then you wouldn't have had to say to everybody, stay at home so you don't get sick. And if you get sick, stay at home nonetheless. Don't come to the hospital. And that discourse then got picked up by our European interior ministries. And they, having gone through the 2015-2016 so-called refugee crisis, where a few more refugees than anticipated turned up, and their reaction was, oh, close the borders. And then we had the 2015-2016 terrorist attacks in France, where France said to everybody, oh, close the borders, don't let the terrorists move. And everybody knew that this was a completely ridiculous reaction to both of these issues. One was merely a question of reception capacity for asylum seekers in 2015-2016, make it somebody else's problem, and the terrorism issue was an issue of crime, of policing. So borders were never going to deal with either. But when COVID came along, this had become a path-dependent behavior. So, oh, close the borders. This is going to be a solution. And the only place where closing a border is going to make a difference for more than about a week or two is if you have a small island, a very small island, you know, a 500,000 person island like Malta. They're going to get it eventually, but you can slow it down. But if you're talking about countries like France and Germany, closing the borders means nothing. And so that actually fell into desuetude quite rapidly. And although the measures and the rhetoric remained in some parts of Europe, you can still see vestiges of it. In fact, the idea that border control is somehow a solution to a health crisis, as opposed to reinforcing our health services, actually rapidly disintegrated. Sorry, I've taken more than my time.
No, it's a lovely point, Elspeth. It's about the continuity of borders as political theater, right? Over time, and we see this just again with no public health justification during COVID. Yes, Gareth, and then Shobha.
I think it sort of carries on what Elspeth said, but it was provoked by something Audrey said about the real striking development being stasis within states. And in a way that's true, but what really struck me, and that's I suppose what my piece is about, is the dramatic differences in the way countries approach this, varying from sort of like Spain imprisoning its population for 3 months, from 0 up to Sweden doing nothing really. and the Netherlands never actually stopping people moving around. I mean, there was sort of a closing of many institutions, but you were never stopped from going where you liked or going out. And I found it hard to identify what the origin of these discrepancies is, and I mean, one tempted, because it doesn't really appear to be directly related to intensity of the epidemic, actually, which sometimes doesn't seem that different between different European countries. Maybe it's, as Elspeth said, it's to do with the capacity of the health system to cope. And it doesn't mean the measures were effective. Maybe they were a form of theatre to, the more it was under stress, the more there was a need for some kind of symbolic action. Or maybe it's to do with like the meaning of movement in different societies and the extent to which that's seen as a kind of proxy for freedom and something of great symbolic value. I had a Polish colleague who said, the people in Poland are desperate for the government to lock them up. They really want to be locked up by the government because that makes them feel that it's all going to be okay and they're safe. Whereas, in the Netherlands, it's basically be kind of mild grumbling and every measure is seen as an infringement of liberties. So I thought, the meaning of movement as freedom maybe plays a slightly bigger role than governments like to admit. They like to present this as a kind of scientific policy, health policy, but then I can't really explain the differences.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. And, I think one of the most fascinating things in the US is we never saw, in comparison to the EU, as well as Australia, right, which is still shutting down its state borders, we never saw a shutdown of state borders, despite, I live pretty close to New York and the numbers were crazy there. And there was, well, you have to quarantine when you get here, but who's watching? And there was never any sense that we would shut down state borders because that would have just been politically untenable, right? So it's about the political boundaries of what's feasible. Yeah, Shobha.
I just wanted to make a small point about international students in the US during COVID. I think the consistency might be a major event happens and we see a significant drop in international students like we did after 9/11. The consistency might be there's huge revenue to be found with international students coming into the United States and, paying high tuition to attend our colleges and universities. What's unusual during COVID is that there were two pretty dramatic attempts to keep out students, either by forcing students here, taking a full course online, or those seeking entry from being able to study in the US at all. And also through these 14-day bans by leaving students out from being able to enter the US had they spent 14 days in a particular country or region. And I think what breaks from the continuity is the tremendous political and public pressure that was placed criticizing these policies, and the fact that that pressure was coming from the universities and colleges themselves, because that really caused a swift reversal in these policies, from Harvard and MIT leading litigation to challenge the international student bans for those who are taking fully online courses. So I wanted to add that nugget because it, to me, is a different observation and breaks from some continuity that we've been talking about.
Great. Thanks so much. Before we move into the next question, Matiange, did you want to jump in on continuities with colonialism? Did you have anything you wanted to add there, or are you happy to let us move into the next question?
Sure, I wasn't sure where to jump in. So thank you.
As the kind of health person rather than migration person in the crowd, right?
Sure. So I do have a lot of thoughts to say about sort of continuities with colonialism that we see in the current moment with COVID. And certainly one of the key things that we see is just the ways in which the othering and racialization of diseases remains constant. And so the mapping of illnesses and diseases and the sort of resurfacing of persistent but problematic settler colonial understandings of people of color as disease, and mapping that onto bodies that travel across borders. And so we've seen COVID give rise to xenophobia and racism that have been undergirding migration generally, but that's also a space where we've also seen the ways in which global health has been racialized from its founding by trying to contain disease threats from colonial territories. And the emergence of the global health regime was primarily influenced and understood to be protecting the colonial metropole from, the metropole from the territories and from the populace in the center being impacted by diseases impacting the periphery. So I see so many parallels in what's happening now with COVID, not only from the incessant racist and inaccurate references to COVID-19, which harkens to this long history of othering and denigrating Black and Indigenous people, but also the ways in which historically there have been, more quote unquote sanitary measures that people of color have to go through as part of an entry process, whether that is, more inspection of Chinese migrants or more suspicion that Chinese and other migrants were carrying different diseases. And so in some sense, we've seen a resurfacing of that in the racialized profiling that has been happening with COVID, but also sort of the deputizing of that, with people taking on the role that maybe the state would have played primarily in terms of enforcing who is the diseased body that's walking around, and which bodies are supposed to be subject to a greater scrutiny in terms of their freedom of movement, such that it's not even happening, simply at border. Of course, obviously, the border is a heightened place where that surveillance is happening, but it's also happening just in terms of freedom of movement, just sort of walking down the street and existing in a body that is presumed to be a carrier of disease. And so that is a problematic history that I think continues to inform a lot of certainly the migration law and policy that we've seen in the US. For example, I was thinking about what you said, Jaya, in terms of there being no real monitoring of traveling between states. But I think that is also emblematic right now. The US has no, unlike other countries, right? There's no testing at any port of entry. And there's the presumption that COVID seemingly knows, nationalities, right? It's checking for nationalities, it's checking for green card status, whatever else. And so those who are rendered suspect are primarily foreign, or those who who were never conceived as belonging to the body politic to begin with. And so this is tied to the ways in which US has surveilled people of color, even dating back to the detention of asylees in Guantanamo, Haitian asylees in Guantanamo, that were suspected of having HIV and AIDS and were held without regard to their credible claims of political persecution and the like. And so with Title 42, as Jaya well knows and can speak to with far more detail, we see sort of resurfacing of that, right? So who is the threat, and how is that threat mobilized in ways that are racialized, and how does that play on sort of colonial understandings of disease threats from people of color? So a lot of I'm here sitting and listening and learning more than anything, but I see a lot of parallels in what's happening now, and how diseases have been racialized in the past. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. And I think if you layer, of course, that on with who's considered essential, right? That it becomes even more concerning, both essential in terms of who's doing the low wage work in the US, but also who's doing the highly dangerous healthcare work. It becomes the colonial continuities become even more concerning. Yeah, Louisa.
No, just to second the points that have been made just now, about the which bodies carry the disease now, COVID before others, and then the theater we see at borders. And what we saw in South America, in Chile, there was more of a continuity, especially towards the Haitians. So of course, there's this racialized aspect of racism, xenophobia, and racism against Haitians, which predated COVID and saw them as carrying HIV, bringing in tuberculosis, right? And it was interesting because those discourses already existed in Chile. So it was very easy then for certain actors to just, kind of copy them. And of course, then it was also the newspapers didn't necessarily say the Haitians brought COVID, but then, it would be about COVID migration and the picture of a Haitian migrant with her baby. In Peru, it was actually interesting because we didn't see it for a long time. And it wasn't that, so it was the other way around. It was when we had a border security crisis, right, between Peru and Ecuador. And it was about migrants coming in at the beginning of this year, that suddenly the topic of, they don't just bring crime, they actually also bring COVID, right, it was picked up in Peru. So I think that's interesting how sometimes it can go both ways, right? It can be, the fear of the migrant bringing COVID, that's why we need the border control, or it can go the other way around, right? We had like the issue at the border with an increase in irregular migration, and then suddenly, certain actors and newspapers picked up this idea of the migrant not only bringing crime, but also COVID, which is ridiculous, especially in Peru with the numbers we had. And what's tragic, and we all know this, we call it a theater at the border, but it has very real life effects, right? And it has very real life effects that are very contrary to what we want in terms of public health. So in South America, for example, we had pre-COVID, one of the good practices was a vaccination passport for Venezuelan citizens, because the health system in Venezuela has broken down, and because there are other diseases, right, that we need to be vaccinated against. And with the closure of borders that are ongoing, but the need to leave Venezuela, irregular migration, which really wasn't an issue until very recently, became an issue, right? And it's so tragic to see how basically populist politics and just trying to score cheaply politically. All things we know, right? But were really put in place and initiated. And now we have this irregular immigration, which we didn't really have before. Thank you.
Thank you. Denise, did you have something you were going to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of chime in on this whole piece of it to note, of course, that then what happens is that Haitians are chased out of Chile as a result of some of these reactions, and out of other countries of South America, and given the horrific crisis in Haiti, make their way to the US border, where they encounter this exact same logic, both of exclusion and threat, but specifically of carriers of disease. And so then Title 42, the Centers for Disease Control expulsion policy, comes into play in really horrific, of course, and very well documented ways, where Haitians are expelled at a minimum back to Mexico abusively, and often all the way onwards to Haiti, despite every kind of crisis occurring in Haiti, including a health crisis, as part of this, treatment of Haitians specifically as carriers of disease and not proper asylum seekers either. And all of this very much is part and parcel with what others have described as recognizing that the border was, and the policies at the border that were implemented in the name of COVID were never about COVID at all, and how they really tie instead to these conceptions of, who the state must sort of include to some degree and who not, because of course the Title 42 and other provisions at the border were very much focused on asylum seekers, as I've mentioned. For example, they were never focused on citizens or even truck drivers bringing tomatoes across at any point at the border, even though, of course, any objective health consideration would recognize that a citizen or a truck driver would be just as likely to have the possibility of having COVID as compared to a refugee or asylum seeker. And then the last thing I can't resist mentioning is that I don't, and I'm sure this is very much just where I'm sitting in Texas, I don't see here at least this idea of expanded borders within the state and such that the national border, the southern national border, has sort of less relevance. I actually think, to the contrary, if anything, Texas at a state and local level has emphasized even further that no, once you're in Texas, you can do whatever the hell you want, and so that's all the more reason that the border with Mexico has to be reinforced further.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to hand it over to Iris to wrap up. It looks like Caitlin has her hand up, so I'll let you decide what to do next. But we are actually somehow unbelievably almost at time. We knew it would run quickly, but I'll let Iris figure out how to wrap us up.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so we have only 5 minutes, and I wish we had more time because the conversation was really interesting. And I was writing notes, trying to kind of get to, trying to summarize what you were all saying, but there was so much. It's even richer than the book. So I don't know, maybe this is kind of the basis for the second book. Who knows? But shall I really now move on to wrapping up? Because I think really we don't have any more time for any comments, even though I would love to. Yeah,
I think that's right. Unfortunately, I'd love to hear more from everyone.
Yeah. So, I was trying to kind of get some conclusions out of this. And these are, of course, not real conclusions, but the things that I found kind of a message that a lot of you transmitted in your comments. First of all, with regard to the discussion on the concept of essential, it seems to me that all of you or most of you are basically saying, well, the word essential, the concept of who is essential is about economic background, So what we want to do is try to ensure that the supply chain is working well, that, lorry drivers can get food on time to everybody and so on. So it's an economic concept where essential is no longer just the work that is being done, but also the workers who are doing that, because they are the ones who need to do the work in order for us to get the food and so on. And also what I loved is, all of you stress that essential, the concept of who is essential is not about the political term. And I think that it was Gareth who said, well, what we found out that professional classes are really not essential. Yeah, so all of us, we're not essential. We can travel for pleasure or for work, but we can also, work without that. Essential are lorry drivers, as I think Elspeth mentioned. And also, I think that Sandra also made a very important point, saying that essential is not really a legal term in that respect. So from that perspective, we can talk about an emphasis on economically essential individuals who have kind of come to the surface in this crisis. Now, another thing that I loved, and I think it was really well captured by Audrey, is that with regard to the continuity and change, the continuity applies to external borders. or Audrey simply said borders, but in the context of the European Union, we can talk about the external borders. So borders are there with reason, they're staying there with reason, and maybe they're even getting stronger. That's the continuity. What has changed is what has been happening over the past year and a half within those borders. No matter whether we are talking about what's been happening within a single state or within a supra-state like the European Union, where the intra-state movement or the movement within the European Union has been to a significant degree hampered due to different measures which have been imposed as a response to the pandemic. Now, some of you have also said, well, you know, public health has been used as a justification for a number of these measures, but actually it seems that, and Jaya and I agree with you, and we have also, I think, emphasized that in our editorial, is that basically public health has often been used as a pretext for certain measures which have been adopted, even though they shouldn't have been adopted. And I think that Elspeth also made a good point by pointing out that a number of states have completely closed their borders, even though everybody knew, and this was also confirmed by the scientific community, that this will not protect us really from getting the disease. And then the last point that I would like to make, and then I'll hand over the floor again to Jaya, is you know, the question that we really hadn't so much time to discuss now, but a lot of you have pointed that out in your papers, is that so many different rules have been broken. And this is what we refer to in our introduction as the contestation. So a lot of rules have been broken. Rules at the domestic level, the EU, free movement rules, international rules in terms of, you know, human rights protection, asylum seekers' rights, and so on. And then later on, things seem to have calmed down. And I think that a good example of this process have been the COVID certificates, which have been mentioned by some of you, where the COVID certificates can be seen as a kind of an accommodation of the existing rules within the context of the current pandemic. And I think that in that respect, we are moving in the good direction. Now, the question that seems, you know, to be left somewhere in the air is what comes next, right? So what responses can we really find to all that's been going on? So what responses are available to the impact that COVID has had on migration within Europe, the US, or globally? So once again, thank you. I really, really enjoyed reading your pieces and listening to this discussion, and I'm handing over the floor to Jaya again.
I'll just echo Iris and say thank you so much for the contributions. It was really wonderful to read them as they came in, and you know, just to be able to put them together into a volume, and terrific to have this conversation with all of you. And you know, I hope we can continue it in different fora and in different constellations of peoples, because you know, I think Sankana said, you know, the conversation needs to be global so that we can understand what's happening, and to have any hope of long-term structural change, we need to be engaging with each other. So thanks to everyone for being here and for your wonderful contributions.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you from our side as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely weekend.